Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I wasn't that stressed, but I appreciated the spiritual practice nonetheless, and I appreciate the space that it creates, the openness and the quiet. I actually want to begin with space, place more specifically, with Chicago. The great writer Nelson Algren once said about Chicago that there are lovelier lovelies, but there's never been a lovely so real. Some of you this week might be thinking there's never been a lovely so cold, unless you're from Minnesota, in which case you can expect this weather until July. But place, cities tell stories, or more specifically, we tell stories about cities. So let me tell you my story about Chicago. A few blocks north of here, in an Independence Day celebration in 1858, Abraham Lincoln spoke to this gathered group, and he said, you know, some of you trace your lineage back to the iron men of the founding. And there was applause, these kind of pride of these people and their lineage. And Lincoln let this applause go. And then he said, but you know, we're not a nation of ancestry and genealogy. There are other people here. And he named the new nations that newer arrivals had come from, other nations in Europe at the time. And he said, these people from France and from Scandinavia, all of them, all of us, if we hold to the ideals in the Declaration of Independence, that all of us are created equal, then we are all flesh of the flesh and blood of the blood of the people who wrote those lines. And so let it be so. East of here, 1893, September 11th, an immigrant named Swami Vivekananda comes to the United States, and he gives a speech at the Art Institute at a place called Fullerton Hall, just past the Lions at the entrance. He talks about the spiritual unity across all religious traditions. Says this is what we must base our civilization on. That is the opening lines of the Parliament of the World's Religions. And amongst the closing lines are these. From now on, the great religions of the world make war no longer on each other, and instead on the giant ills that afflict humankind. West of here, about a mile, a young woman named Jane Addams sees newcomers coming into the United States, racist movements calling them strangers. She has a different name for them. The name is Citizen. She establishes a place called Hull House. She calls it a cathedral of humanity. They do a study of their neighborhood. They discover there are 7,000 school-aged children, but only 3,000 seats in the local schools, so they build a school. They discover that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of families, but only 3 bathtubs, so they build public baths. They recognize that these immigrants have crafts, foods from their own countries, so they build a public kitchen, and they build workshops where people can share. And she says, you know, for those of us who might have been here for a while, we have to recognize that the good we enjoy is precarious and uncertain, until it belongs to all of us and it is spread throughout our common life. South of here, 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. leads with a set of Catholic priests a fair housing march in Marquette Park. Rabbi Marks is on the sidewalk, an observer from the Reformed Jewish community. He writes later that he felt that his tradition was calling him to be in the streets with the marcher. These are not moments to observe, he says. These are moments to participate. The first permanent memorial to that march and to Martin Luther King Jr. in the city of Chicago is built by an Islamic organization, the Inner City Muslim Action Network. We commemorate King, that Muslim group did, with the statue of a Jewish rabbi, Robert Marks. Welcome to Chicago, at least my story of the city. This is not, as you can tell, a melting pot story. This is what I think of as a potluck nation story. A story where the only way the nation feasts is if diverse communities contribute. I think a potluck is about the best metaphor that there is for a diverse democracy. Why? Because if people don't contribute, there is no meal. And if all the dishes are the same, it is really boring. Plus, imagine the nightmare if you spend all day making the dish that your great-grandfather taught you how to make, or making the dish that you just made up last week, and you come to this potluck and you are met at the door with this giant melting machine, which melts your contribution into the goo that everybody else's contribution is melted into. That's not a feast. That's a nightmare. A diverse democracy is a place where people from different identities contribute. They connect. They cooperate. They nurture a commitment to the common good. You're not going to like every dish at a potluck. Diversity, this, by the way, is my best line in 10 years. Diversity is not just the identities you like. Diversity is not just the identities you like. But you don't go around actively looking to dislike things. And you don't look to exclude people from a potluck. Sure, you don't want poison there, but nobody at a potluck is doing poison checks. You assume the best of folks. You create a space that invites the best. And maybe you get surprised. Maybe something you didn't like the first time you tried it, for whatever reason, in that space or with that array of dishes or with that group of people, makes sense. America is a potluck nation. And metaphors matter. Great line by Walter Lippmann. The way the world is imagined will determine at any time what human beings will do. The way the world is imagined will determine at any given time what human beings will do. But we need more than imagination. We need actions, which is why I love the insight from Howard Gardner. He says that what leaders do in the world is they tell a fresh story and they embody it with their actions. Listen, nothing good or bad when it comes to civic stuff falls from the sky or rises from the ground. People build these things, which is why I love what Jen Bailey and Lennon Flowers have done with the People's Supper. I love what Questlove has done with the mixtape potluck. You hear about this. He sends a song to you. You bring a dish inspired by that song to his potluck. People build potlucks. We build civic spaces that depend on shared activities that guide cooperative relationships that are mutually beneficial. You can tell that I carry the baggage of graduate school with a mouthful like that, right? But I just want to repeat, what do civic leaders do? We build spaces that have shared activities that guide cooperative relationships that are mutually beneficial. You know, the Chicago singer-songwriter Andrew Bird has this line that we're caught in a death grip, and it's taking its toll when our enemies are what make us whole. Look, you can't have a diverse democracy if you're constantly looking for enemies. A diverse democracy depends on spaces that have shared activities that bring people into cooperative relationships that are mutually beneficial. Because at the end of the day, you can't live permanently in a more furious revolution. You have to, at some point, build a more beautiful order. I want to focus our attention for a moment on a dimension of our cities, of our common life that I think is often overlooked. It's the dimension of religious diversity. Imagine for a second some of the most beautiful phrases in American civic life. King's beloved community, Jane Addams' cathedral of humanity, Lincoln's better angels of our nature, and the idea that Americans, all of us, from everywhere, are an almost chosen people. It's impossible to recognize our common life, our language that we use to bind us. And religion at its root means to bind. It is about spiritual connectivity without language like that. It's actually impossible to imagine our civic life without the contributions of diverse religious communities. I want to do the nightmare scenario for just a moment. Imagine that you're back in your hometown, wherever that might be, from Tulsa to Buffalo, and imagine that tomorrow morning, all of the faith-based institutions, all of the Catholic schools, all of the Methodist hospitals, all the Lutheran social service agencies, the mosque where there's a distribution point for the food depository, the Jewish Community Center, the Secular Humanist Society, they're included in my definition of interfaith here. Imagine they all close down. Seriously. What does the civic life of your city look like? What does the town look like at all? There are major contributions that diverse religious communities have made to our common life. It's actually remarkable to think that many of these institutions were founded first as a place to nurture the particular identity of those Lutherans or those Methodists or those Catholics or those Muslims or Baha'is or Buddhists or Jews. And they have grown into places that welcome all of us, not because the Lutheran Social Service Center became less Lutheran, but because it re-understood the definition of being Lutheran as something that serves the common good in a diverse democracy. I think of the religiously diverse dimension of who we are as America a little bit like William Carlos Williams' red wheelbarrow. So much depends on it, and we will only notice that if it goes away. America was actually the world's first religiously diverse democracy. The first nation to believe that people coming from the four corners of the earth, praying to God in different ways, including not at all, could come to this patch of land and build out of it a country. For all of the sins and mistakes of our founders, and they are legion and they should not be forgotten, this should also not be forgotten. That the first Iftar in the White House was not hosted by Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, but by Thomas Jefferson in 1803. That Ben Franklin made contributions to the building fund of every religious community in Philadelphia when he lived there. He built a hall, and he said that the pulpit of this hall would be open to a representative of the Grand Mufti of Constantinople. When a Jewish leader writes to George Washington early in his presidency and says, "What will happen to my people, we who have been hated and harassed and hounded for centuries in Europe? What will happen to us in this new nation?" Washington writes back in a great document in American history, the letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island: "My government will give to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance." What does it look like to, in our DEI work, in our civic life, period, to lean into this dimension of religious diversity, to recognize that at the heart of it there is a spiritual connectivity, the idea in Islam that all of us carry the breath of God, the guidance that God gives to the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him, that he is to be nothing but a special mercy upon all the worlds. What if we leaned into this, became proactive about it, instead of treating it like a third rail, something electric that is only going to burn us if we go anywhere near it? What does it look like to be positive and proactive about the religious diversity dimension of our organizations, of our common life together? This is what we've been doing at IFYC for some time. Interfaith Youth Corps, the organization that I lead, at some point a group of us woke up and recognized, so many of our heroes are people principally inspired by religious traditions who begin their work young. King is 26 years old in Montgomery, Alabama, when E.D. Nixon and Ralph Abernathy choose him as the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association. Jane Addams is not much older here when she starts to build Hull House. Dorothy Day is 33 when she founds the Catholic Worker. Gandhi is in his early 20s when he begins the movement against racist pass laws in South Africa. The Dalai Lama is barely in his 20s when he leads his people out of Tibet into India. The stories go on and on and on. Our social movements, our civic life, in no small part built by young people who were inspired by faith traditions, who built interfaith movements. IFYC's work for the last 20 years has largely been on college campuses. There's all kinds of good reasons for this. Who's the guy who said, I think it was Willie Sutton, who said, somebody said to him, why do you rob banks? He says, well, that's where the money is, right? So if you want to work with really smart young leaders, you go where they are. They're on college campuses. Campuses play a huge role in our civic life in America. One of my favorite lines is, if you want to build a great city, build a great university and wait 100 years. Really proud of the work IFYC has done in helping campuses become models of interfaith cooperation and inspiring thousands and thousands of young people with the vision, knowledge base, and skill set to be interfaith leaders. But you know what? We don't have 100 years anymore, right? Generations turn around like every 5 or 10 years now. Things move much, much faster. And there's this little thing that my mom likes to call the Google, right? The internet, right? Well, as my friend Paul Rauschenbusch likes to say, that place is a civil society, or actually a lot of it an uncivil society. In my less charitable moments, I like to say that it is like a cesspool on Mars, which is a little bit of a self-indictment. Why have the bad guys gotten there first? Why are the white supremacists so good online? Why are the religious extremists so good online? What does it look like for us who are so good in physical civic life to be really good at making that cesspool on Mars, known as the Google, etc., an online civil society? A place that feels like a good potluck, where it is easier for people to contribute, easier for people to connect, easier for people to cooperate, easier for them to develop a commitment to the common good. What does it look like to be Jane Addams online? A big part of the story of the turn of the of the late 1900s, of the late 1800s and the early 1900s is urban-based civilization. And people like Jane Addams saying, how do we take the craziness of a city and make it orderly and warm and inviting, a democratic life, not a more furious revolution, but a more beautiful order. A whole civic movement, no small part of it faith-based, emerges in the late 19th and early 20th century to build out of the new industrial city-based economy and society something that is more beautiful. We inherit that. We enjoy that. So we're at a different civilizational transition point now. Online civilization, virtual society. What does it look like to make that a more beautiful order? I think that the ethic that goes for our common life together physically, of welcoming contributions, of nurturing connections, of fostering cooperation, of increasing commitment to the common good, it can also go for our life online. And I think that that ethic is best summed up by the great Chicago poet Gwendolyn Brooks. I'll leave you with her words right now. We are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. Jazakallahu khair. May God give you goodness. Thank you.